This story takes place immediately following the star ending of Cyberpunk 2077, so if you haven't played the game yet, it will be pretty spoiler heavy. Take that how you will. Side note from the narrator. This story is very emotional. It's extremely personal to the author and ended up becoming very personal to myself, as a lot of the contents of this story related to a lot of things I was going through at the time. Most, if not all, of the emotions presented through this reading were real in the moment, and hopefully by the end of it, this story will mean as much to you as it did to me. With all that said, it is an honor to present The Long Road by Valor48. Part 1. I Promise. Staring out across the arid desert before her, V drew a deep breath into her lungs. The hot sun blazed high in the sky, causing the horizon to shimmer. The air was different out here than it was in Night City, devoid of the smells that she'd grown up with and become accustomed to long ago. The grime of the streets, burnt food wafting through the air, smog from the sea of cars that never seemed to recede. It was all absent. In its place was nothing. Must be what clean air smells like, V said to herself. She turned her head and looked back at the camp that had sprung up behind her. It was remarkable just how quickly the Aldecaldos had created a home for themselves. There was nothing special about the patch of desert they'd stopped at, other than the fact that it was only a few miles away from the Arizona border and made for a good jumping-off point. There had been nothing here just a few hours earlier. Now, a massive cluster of tents dotted the landscape, giving the impression of a small, hastily erected city that was surrounded by dozens of beat-up cars, trucks, and campers. The basilisk tank that Panam had driven at the vanguard of their convoy was parked at the outermost edge of the perimeter, dwarfing the other nearby vehicles. Several thin trails of smoke wafted from the camp as families began the task of cooking food. Real food. A welcome change after spending the last few days on a diet of prepackaged synthetic meals. It had been 3 days since they'd left the outskirts of Night City, and V still wasn't used to the absence of motion. They'd stopped only a couple of times to either see to the necessities of life on the road or to sleep at night. They traveled across the wasteland from dawn to dusk, their muzzles cramping up until Panam had finally ground to a halt and announced that it was time for a few days' rest. In the few hours that had since passed, an explosion of life had burst out and an entire community had sprung up. V studied them as they moved, feeling an odd sense of comfort as she saw routines take shape and as friends and family called out to one another. It was becoming clear to her that these people weren't the gang of violent outlaws that she'd always heard about. The Aldecaldos were an actual family, nothing at all like the Claws or Maelstrom or any of the other gangs she'd bumped into over the years. They genuinely cared for one another and would go out of their way to help each other without question, which was exactly what she was counting on. This isn't going to be easy, V thought to herself. V knew nothing about being part of a family or having chooms who actually gave a damn about her. Her life had been one of closely guarded isolation, allowing only the most trusted into her orbit. Even then, she'd kept a safe degree of separation, ensuring no one ever got too close. And for good reason, too. Night City was like a giant slot machine. It promised easy riches, but never paid out, and she'd played it once too often. She'd lost the last few people she considered chooms thanks to a gig that had gone terribly wrong. She'd lost the only place she ever called home, and now she was losing her very life. 6 months. Those words had hit V harder than anything. Granted, When she and the Aldecaldos had struck Arasaka a few days earlier, she'd been in even more dire straits, if such a thing were even possible. She'd been down to just a matter of hours at that point, maybe even minutes. Seizures, nosebleeds, a headache that threatened to cave in her skull. It had taken every ounce of strength she had to make her way to Alt. That was when shit went from bad to worse. Alt. An artificial intelligence that used to be a person half a century earlier. It was understandable that being ripped out of one's body and transformed into a digital consciousness would certainly result in some changes, to put it mildly. But it was only when she'd spoken to Alt that she had realized just how much of her had changed. There was almost nothing left of the human being she'd once been, and V suspected that whatever she'd become in the years since, that there wasn't any way of defining just what Alt truly was. The AI had presented her with a binary choice, laying it out for her in a cold, unsympathetic voice. To either separate herself from her body so she could be consumed by Alt as part of her digital construct, or to return to her broken body that had been irrevocably damaged by the relic biochip. With the construct of Johnny Silverhand no longer loaded onto the chip, she would have some additional time, but the damage had already been done. In 6 months, her brain would have degraded past the point it could function, and she would die. Panam, of course, had vehemently disagreed with that assessment and had committed herself to getting in touch with her contacts in Arizona. Contacts who, she believed, might be able to help her. The details were scarce, though, and V privately didn't hold much hope in a solution for her dilemma. The damage the biochip had done to her body was extreme, and the degradation would continue day by day unless something could be done to not only stop it, but to reverse it as well. During their flight from the city, there had been precious little time for her to consider the gravity of her situation. It had lingered in the back of her mind, though, always present, and as V started to walk back towards the camp, it dawned upon her that now that things had slowed down a little, she might soon have too much time with her thoughts. "Hey you," a familiar voice called out. "Was wondering where you went." V turned to see Judy walking towards her with a smile upon her face that she quickly returned. Judy had wisely changed her attire to something more befitting the intense heat of the desert, opting for a pair of denim jeans and gray tank top. The colors seemed strangely muted against the vivid pink and green highlights in her hair and the plethora of tattoos that lined her skin, a constant reminder of her past and the journey she'd taken through life. Judy's appearance was a fitting contrast to her own, V realized, as she ran her hand through her own hair. Though it was longer and a vibrant shade of pink, they both carried the same hairstyle, which was common in Night City where neural implants were the norm. Of course, Judy had her beat in the tattoo department. V's only markings were of the scarred variety from a lifetime of growing up on the streets.
"At least one of us has some sense."
V peeled off her leather jacket, which had turned hot to the touch. It made sense to wear it during the drive when the sun hadn't yet risen above the horizon, but she had forgotten to take it off once they stopped. As soon as the jacket was off, she felt cool air rush against her skin. It was a pleasant sensation that widened her smile. She knew she was going to have some difficulty in adapting to this way of life and had found herself impressed by just how quickly Judy seemed to already be adapting. Judy Alvarez. V would have never thought it would be possible for someone she had known so briefly to have become so important to her. Just months ago, the name would have meant nothing to her. Just another name in the sea of people that inhabited the vast metropolis of Night City. It was a strange irony that the same job which had resulted in V being handed a death sentence had also been the catalyst for bringing Judy into her life. In the weeks following the failed heist, Judy and V had slowly drifted closer together, perhaps bound by the recent tragedies which had unfolded in their lives. Both had lost their best friends to the fallout which had followed from the heist, and both had found themselves searching for something more, with only each other to talk to. Judy, in her unmistakably brazen way, had made the first move by inviting V to explore her childhood home of Laguna Bend. Having been flooded and submerged for years because of corporate greed, the small town had provided a surreal backdrop where Judy and V had shared each other's memories and emotions. As fortune would have it, V had nearly died that night, and surely would have had Judy not been able to pull her to the surface and resuscitate her after experiencing her worst seizure yet. The memory of seeing Judy leaned over her when she had awoken was one V would never forget. That night, when they made love for the first time, it was more than what V could comprehend or take in. Of course, she had been with others before, but the way she had felt was wholly unique, and suddenly a flood of possibilities had been unleashed in her mind of what a life with Judy could be like. The possibilities had seemed endless, if only not for the agonizing reality that was embedded within her skull and would soon take her life. Before she had left the next morning, V had promised to make things up to Judy, to one day take her away and to leave behind the city which had stolen so much from them, to start something new, together. But in the back of her mind, V hadn't believed herself. In the days that followed, her condition worsened, but Judy remained by her side. Finally, the night came when V had to make her move against Arasaka. Her time was nearly up, and she was worsening by the hour. She had called Judy that night, unsure of what to say. How was it fair to become so attached to someone in such an intimate way, and for them to have found an equal bond in you, and then to have the rug pulled out from under them and to be forced to say goodbye so soon? V could see that Judy had been on the verge of tears that night, and she felt her own heart break as she said what she thought would be her final goodbye to her. But V had survived, even if only for a while, and Judy had agreed to leave Night City behind for good and to go with her. "Hey," V called back to Judy. As she came to a stop beside her, V reached out and pulled her in closer, resting her head against Judy's as they looked back at the camp together. "So, where is our new home on the road?" V joked. Judy pointed behind her. "Last tent on the left. Looking forward to spreading out a little after that long road trip." To emphasize, Judy rolled her neck and shoulders. "I hear that. Could certainly spread out a little myself," V said with a sly grin. Judy took V's hand in her own. "Touché. Come on, I'll show you our new digs." V let Judy lead her between the maze of cars and tents until, just as she had said, they reached the last tent on the left. She wasn't sure if Judy had managed to set the tent up by herself or had gotten help from some of the others, but as V approached, she couldn't help but feel a tingle of excitement.
Our new home.
V pulled back the flap and walked in, followed closely by Judy. Her excitement transitioned into a new emotion which pulled at her heart. She had expected to see a pile of boxes stacked messily on the desert floor and not much else. Instead, Judy had already laid out the few things they had packed up in intricate detail around the tent, as well as set up the cot and bedding she had taken from her apartment. She had even placed a small table,
Where did that even come from?
near the back corner with a pair of monitors and some other gear that V didn't recognize, assuming it must have been related to her editing work. Under the table were a pair of boxes laid next to each other that she had thrown their clothes into. "So, what do you think?" Judy asked. V turned to face her with wide eyes and could see a hint of pride in Judy's face. "Judy, it's completely Nova. I mean, fuck. How did you do all this so damn quickly? I have my ways. Hard to start something new by living out of old boxes." V looked around once more, taking in her surroundings and the care that had been put into the little space they would call their home for now. "New," V repeated as she pulled Judy towards her. "I like the sound of that." As they stared into each other's eyes, V realized this was the first time in 3 days they had truly been alone with one another. Sure, they had been able to chat when they had been on the road, but the constant radio chatter and bustle of the clan had made it virtually impossible for them to have any real time to just be. In fact, it was the first time they had been alone since V had learned of her eventual fate. She felt a sudden knot form in her stomach. She hadn't told Judy yet. After all, how could she? Of course, Judy had wanted to leave Night City too. She had even been planning to do so before everything had hit the fan. But how could she look her in the eye and tell her that it was all just a mirage? That everything she had just done to create a home for them was a waste? That in 6 months, things were going to end badly?
No, not yet.
She refused to ruin this moment. V took Judy's face into her hands and pulled her close, bringing their lips together. Their kiss was slow, yet full of passion as V lost herself in the moment. When she pulled back and saw her expression reflected in Judy's, she felt her heart melt. "I like your way of saying thank you," Judy joked with a smile. She reached up and ran her palm across V's cheek, causing V to tilt into her touch. "Can't wait till later when you can thank me more enthusiastically." Judy leaned in and kissed V once more before giving her a devilish grin and walking towards the table to sit. "You can be a real heartbreaker, you know that, Jude? Just remember, no walls here," V said as she tapped against the fabric and worked to compose herself. Judy had a unique way of disarming her and putting her at ease like no one before had. Judy laughed as she picked up her BD wreath from a nearby box, setting it on the table in front of her. "So, what exactly is it that we're supposed to do out here now? I mean, when we're not driving all over the middle of nowhere?" "That's a good question. I'm going to see if I can find Panam and figure out what she's thinking. She seems hell-bent on getting us to Arizona as quickly as possible." V knew what the reason was, but wanted to steer clear of the topic as she picked up a small incense holder which Judy had placed near their bed and looked it over. "That's not what I meant," Judy replied. "I guess, are we supposed to pitch in or help out? Don't know shit about how these people operate. Last thing I want for us to be are those people." V pondered the question. The truth was, she didn't have any idea what daily life was like with the Aldecaldos, certainly not any more than Judy did, at least. She had spent a little bit of time with them over the past couple of months, and any time she had visited their camp, had always seen them moving about and taking care of things which certainly had a reason for being done. But how were they supposed to pitch in and contribute? V's jacket bore the emblem of the Aldecaldos and had been given to her by their former leader Saul with the understanding that she was every bit one of them as the rest. But the jacket hadn't come with an instruction manual on how to live their way. "Let me talk with Pan, see what I can find out. Be back in a bit." You better," Judy replied with a wink. V turned and left just as Judy slid the BD wreath over her head. She wasn't sure how Judy was able to focus so intensely on editing brain dances, particularly in their current situation, though she figured it was likely just a way for her to relax and cope with the sudden onslaught of change which had found its way into her life. It made V happy to know that Judy still had an outlet and could pursue the things that she was passionate about, even amid all this craziness.
"Everything except me."
She shook away the thought as her eyes traced around the camp, eventually finding Panam standing next to the basilisk with a few others. V slowed before coming to a stop a few yards away from them. They seemed to be discussing maintenance which needed to be performed on the massive tank and were close to wrapping their discussion up. As V listened in, Panam's eyes glanced in her direction. She gave a brief nod of her head, which V returned, before she returned to the topic at hand. Panam had been another person who had suddenly found their way into V's life over the past few months and, through a crazy series of events, had become her closest friend. V often had to stop herself from comparing Panam to her best friend Jackie, who had died during the failed heist. She had a very different personality than Jackie had, but shared many of the same traits: headstrong to a fault, loyal, and fierce in her pursuit of what mattered to her. It was no wonder why the two had become such good friends. "Alright, I've got a few other things to see to, so I'll check in with you later," Panam finished. The group she had been speaking to turned and left, allowing Panam to venture to where V stood. "So, how are things, V? All settled in and comfy?" V smirked as she easily picked up on the sarcasm which laced Panam's questions. "Oh, just great. We've already moved in, and we were just about to start decorating the kitchen. I'm thinking beige walls, to match with the natural decor, but Judy's more of a green lover, so we'll see what direction we take." V was proud of her ability to keep a straight face as she threw her own brand of sarcasm right back at Panam. The pair of them could keep this style of banter for hours, and it never got old. Panam grinned. "Shit, V, I wouldn't doubt it the way you two look at each other." "Alright, enough screwing around for now. I've got a long list of things to see to before I can kick back for a bit. So what's on your mind?" V turned slightly to face the direction of the camp. "Well, that's actually what I wanted to ask you about. Everyone around here always seems to be on the move or have something to do. So, what exactly should Judy and I be doing? Last thing I want is for us to be laying around not carrying our own weight." "Ah, I see. Realized you're the fifth wheel now, huh?" Panam asked with a small smile. V quickly turned back to Panam. "That's not what we want to be here, Pan. If we're going to live here with the rest of you, we want to, chip in and try to..." Panam placed an arm on V's shoulder to cut her off. "Relax, V. I'm just giving you a hard time. Look, we'll have time to get you and Judy up to speed on how things work, and I'm sure, given your backgrounds, that there's plenty you can contribute and earn your keep, so to speak. For now, I want the two of you to just sit back, stay out of the way, and observe." Put it this way. Panam slowly began to walk back towards the camp, her hand still on V's shoulder as she pulled her along. "If I were to have shown up at your front door one day and asked you how I could be an awesome merc just like you and adapt overnight to your lifestyle back in Night City, you would have laughed your ass off and tried to get me started on the basics, right?" V could see where the conversation was headed. It was probably best for them to stay out of the way rather than to make fools out of themselves by stepping on someone's toes or breaking an unwritten rule they didn't even know existed. Still, she didn't like the idea of just sitting back while others did the hard work around them. "Alright, you made your point, Pan. Just promise me we're not going to be treated like the odd ones out. I mean, I can deal with it fine, but Judy, you do understand that she completely uprooted herself from her life to come here and follow me all over the ass end of the world, right?" V winced at herself as it felt like her question had come out more aggressively than she had intended. Panam stopped, her expression letting slip just a hint of empathy. "I get it, V, and I know you care about her. Like I told you before we left, you're every bit as much of an Aldecaldo as myself or anyone else you see around here. As for Judy, anyone who can handle your gonk ass has already earned my respect. Thanks, Pan. It's just stressful with all this going on. I think the sooner we can get into a routine, the better it's going to be for us." "Well, don't get used to any routine. I figure a couple days here before we move on and get ourselves over the border. Look, I get it, V. You gotta know the whole reason she's out here following you all over the ass end of the world, as you call it, is because she cares about you and wants to help you with this whole fucked up situation. I'm sure if there was anything she could do..." Panam's voice trailed off as she saw the expression on V's face change to one of awkwardness and shame. "V?" V let out a long sigh as she decided to confess. "I haven't told her yet, Pan. Honestly, I don't have a clue how to. She's already been through so much already, and I'm still trying to figure this whole thing out myself, you know?" She glanced back at Panam, hoping to see some sign of understanding. Panam's expression, however, had hardened. "V, I understand this has to be fucking up your head right now. In fact, I'll just be honest, I don't understand and won't pretend to. But we both damn well know that life is precious, that we risk losing the people we care about at any minute. And honestly, you owe her better than this. Don't fuck around here. There were things I wish I could have told Saul before he... Panam stopped herself as she realized that her voice had been growing louder and was drawing the attention of some who were close by. She lowered her voice. If you really give a damn like I believe that you do, then fess up, V. It's her choice what she does with it. Before V could react, Panam had turned and walked away, leaving V surrounded by faces she didn't know. The sun was sliding further towards the horizon and was now casting long shadows over the camp as the smell of food and burning wood was beginning to waft through the air. In addition to the voices from those around her, V could hear laughter from a pair of children who were running around somewhere close by. In that moment, V felt a swell of emptiness and sadness sweep through her, forcing her to clutch her fists together to keep herself from breaking down. Panam was right, of course, and V resolved herself to telling Judy tonight, but she couldn't get over the complete unfairness of it all. She had already been robbed of so much already and was still being robbed of her life every day, and now she was going to rob the woman she cared about more than anyone else of her illusion of a future together. The injustice of it all nearly overwhelmed her, and she quickly found her sadness turning to anger as she felt her skin flush with heat. V began to walk back towards the tent, trying to calm her nerves and running through ways she could approach the looming conversation with Judy in her head. Judy had known what their destination was when they had left, but not the reason why. The real reason. The walk to the tent seemed shorter than before, and before she knew it, she was standing outside the tent with her hand on the flap.
This is bullshit.
After taking a deep breath, she pulled the opening back and walked inside. Judy was laying on the cot, the light from the BD wreath on her head casting a flickering blue glow across her face. Her hands slowly and deliberately weaved through the air as she lost herself in her art, subtly altering the senses of whatever memory or experience she had immersed herself in. V nervously strode over to her and put a hand on her shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. Judy's eyes glanced in V's direction, not fully seeing her, even though the realization of her presence quickly settled in. She reached up and turned off the wreath, pulling it off her head and blinking her eyes to reset her senses. Hey, you should see what I'm doing with this edit. Some preem stuff, Judy said, clearly satisfied with the work she had done as she removed the shard from the wreath. V noticed that it was of the same design as the one they had scrolled on their dive at Laguna Bend. Don't doubt it, V replied, keeping her eyes on Judy as she sat up and stretched out. Can I see it? Not yet. Still not where it needs to be. Besides, it's gonna be a surprise. Judy focused her eyes on V and could see that something was going on inside her head. How'd the chat with Panam go? Are we gonna find ourselves scrubbing pots and pans for the long haul? She asked with a small chuckle. V allowed a small smile to cross her face. Only if our luck improves. Listen, Jude, I need to tell you some things. Things that I should have told you before we left. Fuck. V's mind was racing, and she could tell that Judy was already worried by her demeanor. How the hell was she going to get through this? She lowered her head and stared at the floor, hopelessly searching for an answer that wasn't there. Judy's eyes narrowed as she reached out and took one of V's hands into her own. With the other, she placed it under V's jaw and gently lifted her head to meet her gaze. What Judy saw looking back at her brought a chill to her skin. V, what's going on? It's okay, just slow down and tell me what's up. Did your talk with Panam not go well? V shook her head. No, that's not it. In fact, Pan said it's best if we just lay low for a while. Stay out of the way and be observant. V pulled her hand away from Judy and stood up, walking over to the table where the editing equipment had been.
Just tell her, you fucking gonk.
V turned around and took a deep breath, seeing the concern and fear in Judy's eyes. Alright. like I said, I should have told you this before we left. It's just, I didn't really know how to... Oh, that's bullshit, V. You fucking know it is. Alright. The truth is, Judy, you've been through so much already, and I just didn't want to hurt you. V could feel a lump rising in her throat, and her eyes were already beginning to sting as tears formed. Judy sat across from her, silent and listening intently. V knew this wasn't a side of her that she had seen before, and could only imagine what was going through Judy's mind seeing her like this. Still, she had to press on. I told you after Arasaka that I had gotten Johnny's construct off the chip, right? Well, it turns out, after everything I went through, everything I did, the damage has already been done. V could feel herself on the verge of losing control as her voice began to shake. Judy stood and made her way over to V. She reached out to put her hands on V's shoulders, though V quickly refused and backed further away into the corner. What damage? V, what are you talking about? V took a deep breath and steeled herself to say what she hadn't realized until that moment would be the hardest words of her life. Oh, the chip has already screwed up my head real bad, Jude, V managed to say as a sob escaped her throat, the words becoming harder to get out. I've only got 6 months before I'll die. The last word barely squeaked out of her throat, and V could no longer hold back the pain. She lowered her head as her shoulders began to shake and tears rolled down her cheeks. At that moment, a tidal wave of memories crashed through V's mind. The elation she had felt walking into the Afterlife Club with Jackie for the first time when they had scored their first major gig. The smell in the air when she had gotten off the plane at Atlanta and seen the unfamiliar city, her first trip out of Night City. Her first meeting with Padre, the fixer that had taken her under his wing when she had first started out in her life of mercenary work. Her mind drifted further back, recalling disconnected images and sounds of her childhood growing up on the streets of Night City, living in the alleyways of the Kabuki district with her parents, before a long-forgotten memory of her father suddenly surfaced. She had been standing near their tent they lived in, seeing her father turning to look at her with an odd expression on his face, surrounded by a group of unfamiliar... V took in a sharp breath as the last memory began to form in her head. She quickly forced it back down into her subconscious. She couldn't relive that now, particularly as she knew this would be another one of those moments she would always remember for all the wrong reasons. She glanced up at Judy and immediately wished that she hadn't. There was a wild mix of emotion on Judy's face. Shock, fear, anger. You're sure about this, V? Judy asked in a low voice. V nodded, trying to collect herself. Yeah, I'm sure, Jude. 6 months is all I've got left. Maybe a little more or less. The silence hung in the air. The ugly truth had been exposed. It was Judy who finally broke it. And you didn't say a fucking thing to me about this? I mean, what the fuck, V? You just kept this from me? You fucking lied to me from the time we left? Judy was beginning to pace back and forth in the tent, her voice rising as her anger boiled over. V's eyes widened as a mix of shame and fear rolled across her, causing more tears to fall. I'm sorry, Jude. I didn't want to scare or hurt you. Pan says there might be someone in Arizona who could help. I'm not sure how, but it's at least something for me to hope for. She had seen Judy's anger before, though never directed towards her, not like this. V felt as though everything they had built together was suddenly in danger of collapsing.
All because I couldn't tell her the truth.
Something to hope for? What is this to you? Judy asked, waving her hand between them. I thought we were something to hope for, or was that just more of your bullshit, V? Judy, please, I'm really fucking scared, alright? V had never felt so vulnerable in her life, and realized that her words were a direct reflection of what she had been feeling for the last 3 days and had been unable to express. I'm so sorry. Judy stopped in front of V and gazed at her for what felt like an eternity. V couldn't read her expression or figure out what Judy would say or do next. All she could do was stare back at her, hoping her eyes could convey the apology which her words had tried to and failed. Judy's gaze softened slightly. I believe you. Yeah? V replied. Yeah. I get it, V. It's just... I've had enough fucking manipulation and bullshit in my life that I don't need it starting back up with you, of all people, Judy said as she stepped closer to V. She reached out once more to put her hands on V's shoulders, firmly this time, to express her point. No more lies. I trust you, and you need to trust me. If you've got something going on with you, I need to know too. I care too much about you to... Judy's voice trailed off as though the weight of what V had told her suddenly hit. She took in a shaky breath and looked down to the ground. V reached up, taking one of Judy's hands away from her shoulder and placing it on her cheek. The warmth of her palm against her tear-streaked flesh made her skin radiate as she took her other hand and repeated the gesture, placing her palm against Judy's smooth cheek. They stood there for a moment, holding each other before V gently pulled Judy closer so that their foreheads touched. Both women were now looking towards the ground. Judy, I'm still here. And I've got time, and at least some hope that something can be figured out about all this. I just can't lose you. You're the only thing that kept me going those last days, and I want to stay with you, always. Judy lifted her head up, causing their eyes to meet each other's gaze. Her brown eyes were wet, though no tears had fallen yet. You promise me?
I can't, Judy.
I promise, V whispered as she gently pulled her face closer and kissed her. The kiss was different from any other they had shared before. V couldn't decipher the layers of meaning behind it, but she could feel what almost seemed to be an underlying sadness between them. She pulled away and wrapped her arms around Judy, hugging her tightly and clearing her throat. I promise, V repeated, this time with more strength and assertiveness in her voice. She felt Judy's body loosen slightly as she returned the embrace. They stayed that way for a while before they both pulled back, trying to clear some of the awkwardness. Judy gave a quick shake of her head as though she were trying to clear her mind of everything. So, how long do we plan on staying here before we get you to Arizona and get that gonk head of yours fixed up? She said with a small smile. V returned the smile and ran her hand through her hair. She felt as though a weight had been lifted. Pan said we'll be here a few days to rest up before we head out. Then we'll see if there's anyone who can figure out how to fix this mess, she said, gesturing to her head. Judy laughed. It was a welcome sound which caused V to nearly break out into laughter herself. I don't envy anyone who's going to have that job. Yeah, me neither, V replied. As V took in a deep breath, she recognized the same smell of food cooking from somewhere close by, and without warning, her stomach suddenly grumbled. Loudly. V's eyes widened, and she tried to suppress an embarrassed smile as she glanced at Judy, who was also trying to suppress her own laughter, and was clearly failing. Come on, let's get some chow. I can't wait to eat something that didn't come from a bag. Judy walked past V, briefly placing a hand on her shoulder before moving out of the tent. As V followed her out, her mind drifted back to their conversation, and a small frown spread across her face as her own words rang in her head.
I promise.